Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the session, Implement Modern Device Services within Microsoft 365. My name's Liam Cleary. If you don't know who I am, I'm an owner of a small consulting company. I'm a Microsoft MVP for Office Servers and Services, and also a Microsoft Certified Trainer, and also build lots of courses for Skill Me Up as well. So feel free to look at some of those later on. So for this session, what we're going to focus on is obviously implementing modern device services, and we'll focus on 4 key areas. The first one here will be planning for mobile device management, as well as managing device compliance. So once you've obviously got the devices in, what can we kind of do with those? Then plan for devices and applications, which is really going to talk about some of the bring your own device type capabilities. And then, of course, lastly, we'll focus on planning for a Windows 10 deployment, which, of course, is supported as part of a mobile device platform that you would kind of be building. So let's talk about planning for mobile device management first then. So before any device management configuration is completed, you need to look at defining deployment goals and also objectives and challenges to that kind of deployment process. These will then become the basis of a successful deployment. So for example, in the deployment goals, these are long-term achievements that you are looking to implement in order to manage device mobile management. So what's the goal here? So is it that you're trying to protect the devices and that's it? Or do you want to offer some kind of extra protections around? So we have obviously deployment objectives of goals. Then, of course, we have deployment objectives. So these are the actions your organization can take to reach that deployment goal. So your first goal, let's use an example, is I want to protect mobile devices. Now that everybody's working at home, I want to be able to make sure that, Steve or Sue, who's working at home, doesn't just get their mobile device and just connect to the corporate network. Then, of course, your objectives are what you're going to do to meet that goal. Well, we're going to purchase specific licensing. We're going to add specific features and enable certain things. And then, of course, what are the challenges that might come to this deployment? Maybe you're going to have issues around the types of devices that you wish to support. So that's going to be critical to that deployment. The things that could have a negative impact on that deployment. Now, obviously, when we talk about device enrollment, what we mean here is that we're bringing devices into effectively Microsoft Intune. So Microsoft Intune lets you manage devices and apps and how they access company data or applications. So to use the mobile device management or MDM, the devices first need to be enrolled into that Intune service. So device enrollment is the process of connecting the device. So for example, I have a device in front of me. I'm sure we all have. I have an old iPhone. I'm actually one of those hoarders. I have a whole bunch of different phones. So I have an iPhone in front of me and I need to connect that to Microsoft Intune somehow. Then, of course, for you as the organization, it provides you with the administration management of that device. So depending on whether the device is a registered device or a managed device, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, then that determines the kind of management that you have with that device. Then, of course, you can also provide administration management of applications. So I have another phone sitting in front of me, which is my personal phone that I use for everything. That's not my corporate phone, and that would be the phone that I don't want you to protect because it's mine. But if you want me to have my email on there, then of course you have to provide some capabilities, and so that's what's referred to as MAM. So we have MDM, so mobile device management, and then MAM for mobile application management. Part of the device enrollment is it issues a device management certificate to the device, and that comes from your Intune subscription, and it gets pushed down to the device. And then that certificate is used as part of the communication between the cloud and your device. Now, of course, when someone goes through this process, that's a few steps they have to go through. Now, of course, if you're enrolling devices, for example, you're purchasing corporate devices and you're having them all enrolled before they get them, then, of course, the end user experience doesn't make any difference there because it's already done. But if it's for a bring your own device type capability, then you have to set that expectation for those end users. So what are the types of enrollments that are available? Well, of course, we have the BYOD, or bring your own device, and that's done using the company portal app. And so that was a specific app that you download. So if you're using an iOS, you go to the Apple Store and download Company Portal. Or if you're using a Android device, you can go to the Google Play Store and then download that Company Portal app as well. You also have Device Enrollment Manager. So that's a fully structured enrollment process. And this is my device, and I'm going to go through that enrollment process. We also have what's referred to as the Apple Device Enrollment Program. So, for example, you're shipping the actual iOS devices just for Apple, for example, and it's going through this program where they are already pre-configured with some connectivity. Then, of course, you also have Apple Configurator, which is either USB kind of connected to it, or you have the direct configurator. Now, it depends what you're trying to do. So, for example, if you're using a Mac device, you may want to use the Apple Configurator to build the policies and connect it in, then it connects to Microsoft Intune. But we're not going to focus on all of the individual ones. We're just going to kind of talk about standard enrollment methods and things like bring your own device. Now, the device options. So, for example, as an Intune admin, you can configure device enrollment to help users and then enable that Intune capabilities. Now, the Intune includes the following types of enrollment. So, the terms and conditions. So, this is a block that comes up that allows the end user to select that option and say, yes, I understand that we're going to be connecting, and these are the terms and conditions for that company portal. Then, of course, we also have enrollment restrictions that can be applied as well. So you can choose to limit by the device platform. So, for example, if it's iOS or Android, you can also do the number of devices per user. So if somebody tries to connect, thousands of different devices, you can obviously restrict them at that point. Or you can even block personal devices based, on it being just a personal device. It's not corporate. You also can utilize corporate identifiers. So you can manage and list the IMEI numbers, or the International Mobile Equipment Identifier numbers, and the serial numbers for identifying if it's corporately owned or if it's something else. And then, of course, we can also force multi-factor authentication. So you can require users to use an additional verification method, such as another phone, a PIN, or biometric data when they go to enroll that device. So let's go on to my Office 365 tenant. So let me just come out of here, and I'm going to make this full screen just for a second. And from here, what I'm going to be able to do is I'm in my default tenant. I'm going to click Show All in my Admin Center, and I'm going to click on Endpoint Management. Now, there is another way of doing this. You can actually go and browse over to the Azure portal and actually just click Intune, and then Intune goes into here. It's not the same as the Endpoint Manager. So functionally, there are some components that don't show. So just be aware, if you do go that way and go portal.azure.com and then type in Intune, some things don't show up. So I'm going to click on Devices on the left-hand side, and you can see from here I've got my device enrollment process. If I click Enroll Devices, I'm given a series of options that are available for me to be able to enroll devices. So if I click Apple Enrollment, you'll see that the first step is some prerequisites, and then I obviously need to configure into my Apple tenant. I have to come back and say, okay, I want to allow this type of connectivity. If I'm doing Android devices, I can do the same. So I have to have a managed Google Play account and register that in to allow that. Windows enrollment obviously works out of the box because it's a Microsoft platform. So that just functions as expected. So for example, if I wanted to go to Apple and do Apple MDM push certificate, it's going to take me through a wizard here where I'm going to have to log in with my Apple ID. Now bear in mind, it's not just a regular Apple ID. This needs to be one that's kind of configured into the business services of Apple. So just be aware that kind of needs to take place. Now, if we go back over to devices here and then pick the types of policies that are listed, we can do the enrollment restrictions. So what we can see here is the list of enrollment restrictions. I can say create restriction, and then I can say device type in restriction. Everything has now been built into a wizard process. So I'm going to call it iOS restriction, and I'm going to click next. It's then going to come back and say, well, what's the restrictions that you wish to put in place? So for example, I'm not going to worry about Android. I'm just going to get rid of Android, Mac OS, Windows, etc. and I'm going to say I want to allow iOS or iPad, and I have the minimum maximum number of versions that I wish to have, and then I can say personally owned or not. So I'm going to say no, let's block personally owned. Now, how does it differentiate between the two? Well, that's based on the IMEI numbers and the identifiers that you have in the organization. So I'm going to click next. That's going to be my policy. And then, of course, I get to choose groups that need to be included in this. So this is the security group. So, for example, my executive group, I can say, there we go. And then I can click next. And then that will go through and create my platform kind of policy that says iOS is enabled, everything else is restricted, and personally items are allowed. So fairly straightforward. I'm going to click back into here for a second. If we click on iOS and iPad, then of course when we get into here, we get to see any types of devices that have been connected. So I can see the list of them. If I click iOS iPad enrollment, it takes me back to here. And then underneath that, we have compliance policies, configuration policies, which we're going to look at in a second. But from connecting, if I'm not registering a device, it's as simple as me opening the company portal app on the device and then signing in with the account that I need to sign in with. Now, I'm going to do that shortly, but at this moment, I'm not going to add it in yet. So it's really straightforward. We come into Endpoint Manager. We go through the process of configuring it to talk to the Apple or the Google or Microsoft Windows, etc. And then we're able to move forward from there. So let me just go back to the slides, and then we'll come back and talk about managing those. Okay. So when we have devices connected, our next task is to figure out device compliance. Because, of course, we don't necessarily know that the devices coming in are coming in from the people that are supposed to have the devices, or that the devices are even compliant to any of the corporate policies that we may have. So when we think about device compliance, there's two types here. So there's conditional access device compliance. So conditional access is a service in Office 365 for conditionally controlling the access. So for this one, it's for devices that comply to policy rules. You can give these devices access to specific applications. So specific resources. So I want to allow this type of device to come in and connect to SharePoint Online or maybe Exchange Online. Then, of course, the outside of this is if the devices don't comply to policy rules, then they won't get access to that. So it's a really kind of cut and dry process using conditional access. We can also do without conditional access as well. So you can also use device compliance without them. When you use those type of compliance policies, the targeted devices are evaluated independently of those compliance policies, and then their status is reported. So, for example, if a device is jailbroken, it would be reported, to Office 365. Now, when you use the compliance policies without conditional access, there aren't any access restrictions to organization resources. So I noticed in the question there was a question around managing Teams devices and things like that. If we're not using things like conditional access, then of course there's no restrictions to control. But if we're using conditional access and some of the Teams capabilities, then we can control those types of devices that are being connected. Now, of course, with everything in Office 365, or at least in the Microsoft 365 cloud as a whole, it always comes back down to licensing. So in order to utilize conditional access, you need to be licensed for Azure AD Premium P1 or P2 licensing, Microsoft 365 Business licensing, or the Enterprise Ability and Security E3 and upward licensing. So this is a conversation that you need to have at some point around the licensing that you need to issue to your end users. So are you having E3 licenses and then bolting on Microsoft Intune, for example, or the EMS security licensing, or are you doing it a different way? But it's important to get the licenses right so that you can then utilize the capabilities. Okay, so when we look at designing conditional access policies, there's 6 key kind of things to consider. So the first one is block access. This is one of the options that's available within the conditional access policies. So this option is to block access, and it trumps all of the other assignments that you apply to a specific user. So if you say block, that's it. The device doesn't connect, and there's no way that that user can get in. It has the power to block the entire organization from signing into. So when you actually create the conditional access policies, it does come back and say, please be careful, don't apply them because it may actually impact every person in the organization, including you as an administrator. If you want to block access for all users, you should at least exclude one user. So these are often called as emergency access accounts. So that's just one important thing that you need to be aware of. Okay, the second one is require multi-factor. So to simplify the sign-in experience of the users, you might want to allow them to sign into the cloud apps using a username and a password. However, typically there are at least some scenarios for which it is advisable to require a stronger form of account verification. Having been involved in multiple Office 365 environments where potentially they've had breaches, honestly, if multi-factor was enabled, it would have fixed that problem. So it's important to have a conditional access policy that could potentially limit and force multi-factor authentication, especially when you think of bring your own device. If I'm connecting in from home on my home Wi-Fi, you don't know what I'm doing on that Wi-Fi, and you don't know what I'm doing on that device. So force that multi-factor. You can also then, with conditional access policies, you can implement automated responses to sign-ins, for example, from potentially compromised identities. So the probability that an account has been compromised is expressed in the form of a risk level. So we can build a user risk sign-in type policy, and the two risks are then calculated by the identity protection platform if that's been enabled, and then we can respond to that and action that. So even if it's a device that you're allowing, if there's something wrong with the account or it kind of picks it up that it's a risky account, we can stop that from connecting. We also have the ability to say, well, I need to require managed devices. So being able to control the types of devices that come in. So instead of allowing everybody to bring your own device and connect, you can force it and say it needs to be a managed device, which you can then control further to the application level and say, I only want these devices to connect to that. We can also require approved client applications. So for example, most of the projects I've been involved in recently have been helping people kind of deploy Microsoft Teams and a few other bits and pieces to handle the work at home scenario. And so this is one of those ones where you want to require approved client applications. So being able to manage, if you can't manage the entire device, you at least want to be able to manage the data that's on that device. So that's a critical one here. So if they're using mobile devices for both personal and work, then you want to have a look at, well, I want to allow them to be productive, but I also want to prevent the data loss that could happen. And then, of course, we can block legacy authentication. So Azure AD supports most authentication authorization protocols, including the older legacy authentication. So you can actually prevent that to ensure that everything is being done via the most secure mechanism for authentication. Okay, so in order to do this, we need to look at creating a device compliance policy. So to do this, we're going to navigate to the Intune portal, or at least the endpoint protection portal, as it's now called. We're then going to click device compliance, and then we'll create a policy. And then as you can see on the right here, we're going to configure specific platforms and policies, and then we're going to save and enable that policy. So let me just go back here. Okay, so we're back in the Endpoint Protection Manager again, and you can see we can go to Devices, and right underneath Policies, you can see my section. I can go to Compliance Policies and click here. Now, out of the box, I'm using a Microsoft tenant, so it comes with Contoso MDM Compliance Policy, but I can also just create a new policy. Now, when we create a new policy, the first thing we have to do is to specify the platform. So I'm going to focus on iOS and iPad. And then you can see the policy type is already being configured for me. I'm going to click Create. And then I'm going to say iOS Compliance. Just make that and choose Next. Now, once we get to this screen, we get to then choose what the compliance settings. So I'm going to expand some of these so we can scroll backwards and forwards. The first one is email. So, for example, it says unable to set up email on the device. If you ever want to know what each of the options are, you can go to the small i's. It'll say a managed email account is required. Now, obviously, out of the box, it's not going to be required, but I can say it needs to be a required email profile that's been generated from the registration process. So when I open up my company portal and try to connect to Office 365, it will configure an email profile for me. Or we can say, no, I don't need to do that. Now, for a corporate device, obviously it's going to be management anyway, and you're going to have put that in. But if it's a bring your own device, you might not want to do that. You might want to allow the end user to configure the Outlook client or the out-of-the-box mail client. So I'm going to say require. I can also then check the device health. It's going to instantly look for a jailbroken device because there's a specific signature that comes in. So I can say block jailbroke devices. And then it says require the device to be or under the device threat level. And you can see that we have high, medium, and low, which is done at the point the device tries to connect. And so I can say I need it to be at least a medium. So anything that's above that, it's obviously going to stop and say, no, you can't get in, and block that device. I can then also block by device properties. So let me just close these two here. By the minimum versions of the operating system. Now, this is important, especially, for example, when you know that there's an issue or a security issue with a specific build of, let's say, iOS or Android. You can go in and specify the minimum and the maximum build versions. Then, of course, we have the system security section here, where this allows us to specify things like the password. So I can say require a password to unlock the mobile devices. Now, for my previous company that I used to work with a few years ago, whenever I used a personal device to connect to my email in Office 365, there would be a policy that would come down that would force me to have a password. And instead of the PIN code that I was used to using, I then had to change it ever so often. So, for example, if I say yes, require, I can now block simple passwords. I can say the minimum password length. Let's say we're going to make it complicated and say at least 8. I'm going to make it more complicated and say alphanumeric. Then I can say the number of alphanumeric characters that need to be in there of like the none. So I'm going to say 3. I can then say number of times before the screen is locked, like minutes. So I'm going to say 5 minutes. Maximum numbers of inactivity. I'm going to say 4 minutes. And then I get this kind of resetting of the password capability. So I can say the password expiration is 41 days or 60 days or 90 days. Let's be generous and say 90 days. So that means after 90 days or coming to the 90 days, I will need to reset the PIN code on the phone, even if it's a bring your own device. And then, of course, the number of passwords to remember. Let's make it really complicated and just say 10. And so that's my policy. So I'm going to allow, I'm going to say it needs to have a managed email. I need to meet specific device health. And then I'm going to say system security and choose next. What I can then do is have some actions that take place. So I can say specify the sequence of actions for a non-compliant device. So the first action by default is mark the device for compliance. Well, for non-compliant, sorry. Schedule the days. And then I can say, well, actually, I want to send an email to the user. I want to send a push notification to the user. I want to remotely lock the non-compliant device or retire it. So you have some flexibility. So if I say remotely lock the device, in that workflow process, the device will try to connect. And when it connects, it will go through this iteration. I'm going to choose next. Everything in here can be scoped to specific tags. I'm not going to do tags, but what I can do is associate them to specific groups or every single user. So I'm going to say all users, and I could exclude groups. Now, what I will say when you do this from best practice, don't include everybody in some of these processes, because if there's ever an issue and your device is included in that, that could be a problem. So you often end up segmenting and saying, I want to have all of the users, but then I'm going to exclude like a specific admin group so that those devices don't go through that same policy. It's just a way of managing it a little bit easier. So I'm going to say select groups, wait for my groups. I'll choose executive again, choose next, and then I can review and create that process. So I'm going to click create. My process will then get generated and I have a new profile. Now, of course, once the profile is created, we then get access back to the properties for the profile with edit sections. And then really from the overview one, we get to see a policy assignment. So if I register a device and it goes in this way, it will show as listed in here. You can see the breakdown of those devices. So a device compliance policy is a special way of controlling the access and controlling what the end user can get to based on what the device is looking like and what it's functioning as. So let me go back here. And let's just go back to here. Okay, so let's say we're all working at home now, which we are most of the time, and we need to plan for devices and applications. So you may have a mix of devices that are company owned that have been deployed, and then you may have a whole series of devices that you don't know about, but you wish to allow the end user the flexibility to do whatever they need to. So when we talk about devices and applications, what we're talking about here is kind of planning for devices and applications that are going to be used by the people at home or people that have company-owned devices, and then more focus on the applications that you're going to wish to allow. So we have obviously application controls, we have device controls, and then security controls. So in the application one, we can choose whether to manage a device or just simply protect the applications. So two different types there. That is the biggest question that you have to come up with as an organization. Do we manage devices or do we manage applications? I mean, they are two completely different things, but they serve different purposes too. If you own the devices, then of course you can protect the device because you are deploying them, and then you manage every aspect of that device down to the configuration on the phones, the iPads, the laptops, whatever it would be. If you don't own those phones or devices, then you can only manage the applications, which is fine, because it means you are then controlling the dissemination of your company data, for example. Now, of course, you can create device profiles that allow you to add and configure the settings and then push those to the managed devices. So, for example, this would be, I want to get rid of the lock screen, or I want to have this specific wallpaper, or I want to disable this specific application. Then, of course, from a security perspective, we can define in-tune configuration policies, which are different to device profiles, to protect different types of settings and features. This works really well, for example, when you're doing Windows 10 Autopilot and you need to push restrictions to a Windows 10 device, you would use a configuration policy to control that. Now, the first thing you have to understand is obviously distributing applications. So how are you going to distribute applications to the devices? Are they just connecting into the default access points like SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business? Or are you going to allow them to utilize the apps on the specific operating system? So, for example, if I'm on a Mac, I can download Microsoft Teams. On a phone, I can download Microsoft Teams. And then, of course, on a Windows device, I have Microsoft Teams. So how are we going to control that? So there are two core ways of distributing applications to these types of devices. The first one is obviously a management tool. And this is normally for organizations that are larger in size, and you'll be utilizing a content deployment process. So you probably have a content deployment tool where you're going to be pushing out applications to the devices, or you may rely on Microsoft Intune to push those applications out as part of a profile deployment. Most of this can be done also utilizing a manual installation. So even though you may automatically push those out, it is a fairly manual installation for those applications that come out. Now, of course, the content can be scoped to specific groups of users or employees because you have that flexibility. And employees are not necessarily responsible for installing them because the management process that you went through. So, for example, if you're trying to figure out how to install something onto Windows 10, you're going to have gone through the process as an admin to figure out that installation process and how that works. Now, of course, we can distribute with the store for business and education. So this is a little bit different. You can create a curated list within the store of applications that are available. And then, of course, the deployment process can be done, for example, it will email a link. So after a person goes into that store or the admin goes into the store and buys an application that can be utilized, you'll send the employees a link in an email message, and then they can install the application. Now, the curated list in the private store can include content you've purchased from the Microsoft Store for Business and any of the line of business applications that you have created if they're custom, or they can be ones that have been submitted to the Microsoft Store. So if you have custom ones that you built, they can go into here too for your users, or they can go into the management tool. But for example, if you want to distribute Adobe or a Microsoft Word application or something, they will come from the store for business and education. And then what happens is they are available to all employees. I can open up the company portal application on my device, and when I click on applications in the portal, it will list me the applications that I'm allowed to install. Now, of course, in order to use this option, the users have to be signed in on their device. So, for example, if it's Windows 10, they need to be signed in with an Azure AD account or an Office 365 account on that Windows 10 device. So that opens up a whole separate conversation around Azure AD joined devices to be able to download applications and manage. Now, I said that we'd circle back to this one, to mobile device management versus MAM. So MDM, this is device management policies, which are applied to the entire device. And then, of course, MAM is segmented into managed and unmanaged applications. So if we look at device management policy, you can see that I have some applications here. And if we look at app and data management policy, you can see how they look a little bit different. So in a device management policy, all of the applications are just protected via the device management policy. In actual fact, the applications are not really segmented into anything. It's just we have a bunch of applications on the phone. Let's say we're using an Android phone or an iOS phone, and the device management policy goes in, restricts configuration on that phone, and then allows the end user to deploy whatever the applications are that you've approved. So no segmentation here, nothing required, because the device management policy is controlling the entire device. Now on the right side here, the app and data management policy, that's a bring your own device or a device that you don't own. So now we can now start to split into managed and unmanaged applications. So for example, we've got Twitter and Facebook. Unless you're a very strange organization that's deploying Twitter and Facebook to devices, then in a personal device scenario, there could be a whole number of applications. And those are applications that you shouldn't be managing because you have no control over those. They aren't yours. They are ones that people have installed for them to do their social media or whatever. However, Outlook and Word and PowerPoint and Excel that they're going to utilize for corporate work should be managed. And that's where the MAM process comes in. We get to go in and build an app protection policy, and the app protection policy will say, whenever these applications or this list of applications are utilized, I want this type of protection applied to them. So, for example, stop them from copying data from one place to another, ring fence all of the data that's corporate into just the applications that we allow. Whereas in the device management policy, everything is kind of protected because you own that device. And from an encryption perspective, you've already encrypted all the data on the device normally anyway. Okay, so let's do a comparison between the two. So if we look at potential issues and then obviously MDMs versus MAM. So let's take the first option here. So unauthorized data access. So how is this handled in either or? So for example, if you're using mobile device management, then you're going to require group membership and device enrollment or location control. So to protect unauthorized data access in the policy that you define, that's what you'll create. Now, to achieve the same thing in a bring your own device, you're going to require group membership again, because that's how we can control how the policies are applied. But this time we're going to utilize protected app or location control. So location control is actually visible in all of those. So it's available at any type of policy that you create. You can say trusted locations, these specific locations, multi-factor locations, etc. Let's think of the next one. What happens if the issue is we have a compromised user account? What can we do at this point? So if it's a mobile device policy that's been applied and a managed device, then we can require multi-factor. We can block the high-risk users or medium or low, and then we can utilize device PIN if needed. So we can ensure that the device has those three capabilities. For a bring your own device using MAM, we don't get to put a device PIN, but we can do application PINs. So I can say, in order for you to utilize the Outlook client, I need a specific PIN associated to that. Now, what about if we go a little bit further where it's a compromised device or application? So for a mobile device that's managed, we can require a compliant device because, of course, we understand the managed device, or we could encrypt the device data as well. So we have those two types of things: encrypt the device data, everything on that device, and then require it to be compliant. If it's bring your own device, then we can do a jailbreak check on the app launch. So at the point that someone tries to open the Word application and is logged in with a credential, we can then have something check and say, nope, you can't do this. Or we can encrypt the app data. And that's a recommended thing, that you should be encrypting the data between the apps in a MAM policy anyway. Now, what happens if it's lost or stolen? I mean, this does happen. It's quite frequent. People lose or get their phones stolen. So in an MDM solution policy, we can remove all the device data. So we can effectively wipe the device because we manage the device. In a MAM scenario, we can only remove the data that the applications have been used to using. So, for example, if it's Outlook and Word and PowerPoint and OneDrive, then all of that data that's associated to those applications, we can then obviously wipe. Now, what about if there's accidental data sharing or saving to unsecured locations? How do we fix that issue? Well, in an MDM scenario, we can restrict the device data backups. Now, that might seem like a bit of a strange one, but what that means is we can actually stop the corporate data from being dropped into, for example, an iOS device backup, because there's no need to put the data in an iOS backup that goes into iCloud, for example. We can restrict the save as, or you could disable printing, for example. So we have capabilities to say you can't save it to here. Now, if it's a bring your own device, we do get some elements of comparable features. So we can restrict cut, copy, and paste, or you can restrict the save as to a set of applications that you can utilize. So, for example, you might say, oh, I will allow save and cut, copy, and paste, etc. between this set of applications that we allow. Okay, so let's go back into our tenant. Here. And I'm going to go back here to my devices, and just to make sure that everything loads. So a couple of different things that we can do. So the first thing that we want to focus on is inside apps. And we're going to focus here on doing an app protection policy. Now, when you go into the apps option, this is the MAM type components. And you can see from here, we've got app protection policies, app configuration policies, etc. So let's focus on an app protection policy. Now I have some pre-built. So you can see from here, I've got one that says Android apps data leak prevention, iOS data leak prevention, and then I've got OneDrive mobile policies that I can apply also. So let's look at creating a brand new policy. As with all policies here, you need to specify the operating system, which basically targets the specific devices that you want to create. So I'm going to say iOS app protection, choose next. And then, of course, I can say target to all apps on the devices. I'm going to say yes, or I could say no. And then I could drop that down and choose the types of applications that I wish to assign this to. So I'm going to say managed applications, for example. So I'm going to say I want this policy to be applied to managed applications. Then I can click select public apps. And then right here is the list of all the applications that are supported. So let's say I'm going to type plan. So let's choose planner. I can then say Outlook and SharePoint. So we'll just pick Microsoft once for now. So I'm going to say this app protection policy is going to ring fence to those applications. In actual fact, let's add one more. Teams, because that's a common one that we're rolling out now on most devices. So Microsoft Teams. So I'm going to say this policy is ring fenced to Planner, Outlook, SharePoint, and Teams. I could also then select custom apps. Now, I'm not going to add this because I haven't added any in here, but if you have a specific custom application you've created and registered, you can then add that too. So I'm going to click next. What it's then going to do is take me to the data protection process. So first off, it talks about data transfer, and right at the beginning is that option. So backup all data into iTunes and iCloud. And I'm going to say no, because my content is going to be restrictive and I don't want it to be out there. Send organization data to other applications, and you get to choose here and say, well, no, I don't want any of the data to be sent to other applications Or you could say, well, yes, I can just say to the policy managed apps, which is those 4 apps that we selected. So OneDrive, Teams, SharePoint, etc. Do you want to save copies of org data? No. Allow users to save copies to selected services. So I'm going to say SharePoint and OneDrive, and I'm going to block, you can see, local storage on the phone. So I don't want to store it locally on that device. I can then say, can we receive data from other applications? I'm going to say only policy managed apps. I can then say restrict copy and paste to just the policy managed applications. I can then go through and say allow third-party keyboards. That's entirely up to you, but I'm going to say no. So this will be a restriction that applies. Or I could say allow. It's up to you. You can then say encrypt the organization data, and by default that is set to require. I can sync the app with the native contacts application. I can block that so the native apps on the device don't come through. I can then print org data. I'm going to block that too. Restrict web content transfer with other apps. And I'm going to say, well, the only thing I'm going to allow here is Microsoft Edge. And then organization data notifications, I can just receive those. Now, what does that mean? Remember, we can click onto the I right here, and it will say, do not share notifications, do not share data notifications, allow or share. I'm going to leave it as allow. So our policy here is restricted to specific apps and then various settings that we define. I'm going to click next. Now we get access requirements. Where do we need a PIN? Yes, we do. And this is a PIN to launch the application, not to launch the device, because the device is yours and you've already gone through the PIN. So you can go through and say, in order to use this application, I need you to put a PIN code in. I'm going to leave it as the default settings, but you can see simple PIN, numeric, touch ID is available, biometric is required. I can use Face ID. I could make them reset the PIN after so many days if you wanted to. And so you can see we have some basic ones here. So click next. Now I get my conditional launch. So on my app conditions, if I just drop it down, you can see that we have, like the previous policy that we created, where there's some conditions that can be met first. So maximum min attempts is fine. There's a grace period for offline. Then we're going to wipe the data. We can also go here and say device conditions. So is it jailbroke? What device model is it? And then we can specify the model. You know, is it a Samsung, whatever it's going to be? Or we could also say maximum allowed device threat level. So we can obviously define the apps, define the data protection, define the access requirements, and then anything around conditions. And then, of course, I can select the groups to include. I'm going to go back to my finance group this time and select, choose next, and then I'll click create. And that's going to go ahead and create my app protection policy. So at that point, once I join in that group and I download those applications, they will now become protected via those app protection policies. We also have app configuration policies underneath that too. So the one that's here out of the box is manage browser app configurations, but I'm going to go here and say managed apps, and I'll just put some text in here. I'm going to say select, and we'll just pick any one of the apps for now. So I'm going to say Adobe Reader. We'll just choose next. And then from here, any configuration values that we want to put to the application. So this is configuration of that application. You can then put in. Now, of course, I just picked Adobe, but let's say Adobe had some parameters that was called test and the value was 1. Then I can put that in, and that configuration gets deployed when those managed applications are there. And I can assign those values. I'm not going to go through complete that one, but it's very specific to certain applications. If you look at the managed browser app configurations one, you'll see from here that if I go edit in the basic, not the basics, if I go here, edit in the settings, you can see that there are some specific configuration entries that Microsoft Intune provides to the managed browser. For example, if you're using Microsoft Edge or whatever the browser would be, and you can see that I'm specifying values such as these are the default URLs that need to be available. This is a blocked URL. So we can push these out with the device when those managed apps get pushed. So an app protection policy gives you the MAM capabilities that you need to control devices that you don't own. Okay, so let's moving on to planning for Windows 10 deployments. So how do you choose your deployment scenario? Well, if we look at the deployment type and then what we would choose, let's say we're doing an in-place upgrade. So when do you choose this? Well, you do an in-place upgrade when you want to keep all the existing applications, when you don't want to plan significant changes to the devices or operating systems, and you can simply just migrate over. The standard one has always been traditional wipe and load. I'm sure you guys have done this before, where you are literally going through and saying start clean, and we just wipe the devices. And then, of course, we have what's called dynamic provisioning. So for new devices, especially with the choose your own device scenario, simple configurations, and you can utilize management tools and then self-service installation. So this kind of brings us into Windows 10 Autopilot. Now, in order to utilize the Autopilot process, now remember, Autopilot is all about automatically connecting to Azure AD, the devices. You're going to need to utilize any of these licenses that are available. So just be aware, this is a great entry point if you want to move Windows 10 devices to utilize the Intune policies that we looked at. Because remember, those policies can also be applied to those. Now, of course, Windows Autopilot includes support for multiple different types of scenarios. It's designed to support common organizational needs, which can vary based on your organization and then obviously your progress of transitioning to like modern management. So, for example, deploying devices that will be set by a member of the organization and configured for that person. Deploy devices that will be automatically configured for shared use, so kind of like kiosks. Maybe you want to redeploy a device back to business-ready state. Maybe you want to pre-provision devices with up-to-date applications, policies, and settings. Maybe you're doing the upgrade, so deploying Windows 10 on existing Windows 7 or 8.1 devices and going up. The nice scenario about this one, which is one that's been quite common recently, is we're shipping out devices. So, for example, I'm doing some work with schools to roll out devices for teachers and students, and they will be shipping out Surface laptops, for example, to the teachers. The teachers simply log in with their Azure AD credential, and the Autopilot kicks off and deploys the device. And the IT for the school, for example, has not touched the device. All they've done is ordered it and created the policy that's needed. So what are the steps for Windows 10 Autopilot? Well, we create the base Windows 10 that we need. We capture the hardware ID of the device. This can often be done. So if you're going to purchase bulk devices, you can have them get the hardware device from there. We then reset whatever's on there to the out-of-the-box experience. We're then going to verify the subscription level that's required. And then we'll configure any of the branding for your organization, any messaging that needs to come up. You'll then configure the Intune auto enrollment process. You'll also then register the Windows 10 device, and then you'll create and assign a deployment profile. So these are kind of the Windows 10 Autopilot steps. Most of these are not necessarily you as IT, and most of those are not the end user. In actual fact, like the base Windows 10 may be you, or the base Windows 10 might actually be done by the vendor that creates the hardware. So, for example, let's say it's Microsoft. Let's say it's a Surface laptop or a Surface Book or something else. The Windows 10 image is already built. The hardware ID they'll get you. The thing that you will have to do is, in the Autopilot process, is reset the out-of-the-box, configure the branding, configure the auto-enrollment, register Windows, and you'll do that with a deployment profile. Now, there are also security features that we can apply to a Windows 10 deployment also. They are mapped into 3 core areas. So identity and access management. So deploy secure authentication and access control to protect the accounts and the data in Windows 10. From a threat protection, obviously we can stop cyber threats as well as identifying and respond to breaches, especially if we integrate into things like Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. And then, of course, we have information protection. So identify and secure the data on the devices, which is going to be a further integration into things like Azure Information Protection or Unified Labeling, which is inside Office 365. Okay, so let's go and have a look at Windows 10 policies that we can create inside Endpoint Protection. So if I go back to my devices here, and you can see that we obviously have, I want to enroll devices, let's say, by Windows 10. And from here, you'll see I've got PowerShell scripts, configuration profiles, and compliance policies. I also have the Windows enrollment screen that we went to before, which gives me all of these options. The first thing here is the auto enrollment process, where we go through and make sure that we've changed these to be set to either some, which will then specify the groups that we want to allow to do the auto enrollment, or we specify all, and then that means that a Windows 10 device is going to then be scoped into MDM. Or we could also use MAM if we wanted to as well. So that's your first task, determine who's going to be utilizing this process from a Windows 10 perspective. Once we've done that, we're then going to define the Windows 10 restrictions or policy. So out of the box, I have one here called Windows 10 Device Config Restrictions, but I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to specify what version of Windows it is, which also includes Windows Phone and Windows 8. I'm going to say Windows 10, and then I'm going to select from the templates that are available. Now, of course, if you pause for a second here, one of the things that you would often do on premises is build group policies to restrict features within the devices. So if I click Administrative Templates and then click Create, we'll wait for this to refresh here. I'm just going to put some text in there, and then we'll do Next. And then from a configuration settings, you can see what actually looks like the same thing. So when you would build a group policy, you're able to come in and say, well, actually, for Microsoft Edge, I want to go to printing, and then I can configure specific settings. So we have the ability to almost do exactly what a group policy does. Now I'm going to go back to devices again, just Windows and configuration policies, and click New. We'll repeat the same process, but this time I'm going to look at the different options available to us. So for example, we have the admin templates, which like we said is the group policy. Then we can do device restrictions. So if I click device restrictions, choose create, I'm going to call it device R, choose next, and then I get the list of configuration settings that I can apply. Now, this is an extensive list. So for example, I can go to the App Store and I can say App Store for the mobile, I can say block. I can say auto updates from the store, I can say block, or I can say not configured. I could go through and say, apps from the store only. I can say any store, or prefer the store, or anywhere. So I can say allow any application to be installed. And then you can define specific things for the App Store section. We could actually go through all of these. So control panel settings, this is going to give us, is the settings stuff going to be available? Can the end user change the power and sleep settings on the device? Are we going to block accounts from being added? We could then go to the general tab, where are we going to block screen capture on a mobile device? So for example, I could block those. Are we going to block the OneDrive sync client, from doing specific things? So you can go through and build this very custom personalized configuration profile. For example, printer, I can set some default printers and add them in. So you're not just limiting restrictions on a Windows 10 device, you're also providing a better user experience to the end user. So for example, in the locked screen experience, I can then control and say, I want this image to be on the desktop when anybody locks the device, and kind of what you can do with that too. So you get the ability to be quite granular. Once you've created those, we can obviously scope them again, but more importantly, we can assign them. So this time it says, do we assign them to all users, all devices, or all users and all devices? Or do we just pick specific users? If I click all devices, it gives me the exclude for the groups. If I click all users, I get the exclude. If I do all users, I can still exclude. And remember, as we talked about before, you'll probably want to exclude as well. So I can say select groups to include, click my finance group, and click next. Then, of course, I have some rules. So assign the profile if, and then I get to say this profile needs to be applied because of this. Or I could say don't assign the profile if, and it matches the OS edition and version. So you have some element of control of when these policies get applied. So I'm going to say next and then click create. And this will go ahead and create my Windows 10 device restriction policy. At that point, when the Windows 10 device is then added, based on me being in the group that requires these restrictions, it will then apply those restrictions to the device. If we go back to device and Windows again. Now, of course, we also have PowerShell script capabilities as well, which can go along with the configuration profiles. So let's say that you've created PowerShell scripts that you execute on devices and you wish to utilize those. We can then say add, and I'm just going to go next here. You select the file, and then you get to choose run this script using the logged in credentials. So you can also use customized PowerShell scripts if needed to actually perform some kind of configuration. Now, what you also have underneath Windows policies is you have the Windows 10 update rings. Now, what this means is depending on the version of Windows, if I create a profile here, I'm just going to show you what the update rings would be. You can see that from the drop down, we have semi-annual, Windows Insider, Windows Insider Slow, Windows Insider Release Preview. So you can control the features and the versions and updates that get pushed out to those devices that you're connecting to. But in the beginning, it's really going to be around defining a configuration policy. Once the configuration policy is in and the device is connected, then of course, as we did before with compliance policy, I can go through and create a compliance policy to ensure, if I just click next here, that the device health, or for example, Defender ATP, it's got a certain threat, or system security is defined in a certain way. So when we think of mobile device management, we need to kind of move away from maybe it's just cell phone devices or tablets. It can also be we shipped a Windows 10 device to somebody and this is the restriction that now needs to be applied. So all of that comes together into the device management and apps. Now, of course, if we go into endpoint protection here, you'll see that we have some things that are in preview at the moment. But one of these is really around attack surface reduction. And this is where we can define a policy that would be pushed and utilized as part of Windows 10. So I'm going to go here and say exploit protection, for example. I'm going to click create. We'll just give it a quick name, choose next. And then you can see that the exploit protection, so this is interesting, you have to define an XML file and upload that XML definition structure into this one to say, these are the things that I wish to enable or disable. If I go back to new policy again and Windows 10, and this time say app and browser isolation and click create, choose next, this will give you some specific settings. So this is application guard for Microsoft Edge. So if you're on a Windows device and you launch Edge, we can then say, I want to enable that for Edge. I want to block copying of information from the Edge browser between the PC and backwards and forwards. Allow specific data to go backwards and forwards, blocking, allow printing, allow print to PDF, allow print to XPS format. So you have some controls that you can apply. So these are not configuration settings. These are security features. Now, this application guard is a Windows feature that you can enable automatically by utilizing PowerShell anyway, or checking it on a Windows 10 device. So this just removes that capability and does it through here. If I click Firewall, for example, and Windows 10 and Microsoft Defender Firewall, give that a name and choose Next, you can see that I get the Windows Defender Firewall configuration too. So all of the things that you would have probably done utilizing group policy and controls on premises, you can now do and more by utilizing the Intune capabilities for those types of devices. Okay. So we've reached the top of the hour. So in summary, we talked about planning for mobile device management, really focusing on when you would want to use either things like mobile device management on managed devices or when you would utilize MAM, so MAM protection as well. We talked about managing device compliance, so the types of policies that you would create to check the compliance of the device coming in. We also focused on planning for devices and applications, and then we created an app protection policy so we could then define and ring fence specific applications and block in things like cut, copy, and paste between them. And then, of course, we lastly talked about planning for Windows 10 deployment and kind of some basic configuration policies. And then lastly, we looked at some of the threat protection or security protection policies that we could create that would be pushed to Windows 10. So hopefully that has given you an insight into mobile device management and mobile application management for devices. Thank you for attending. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them into the chat. Good to hear that, Warren. I'm glad you liked the course. So the question around getting a copy of the slideshow, this will be published out on Skill Me Up, so you can always watch it again as well. And then it's my pleasure, Gareth. I always enjoy going through and teaching things like this and enjoy playing with Endpoint Manager. Okay, well, if there's no more questions, thank you, everybody. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you on another one in the future.